All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and sorry for the delay getting started. Appreciate you participating in our very first public service perspective session of the spring semester this year. We have a really great speaker today, Steve. Before I turn it over to him, I am just going to go over a couple quick housekeeping items. We do ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation to avoid disruptions, but feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat. We'll also take questions at the very end, so you can continue to drop questions in the chat or just use the raise your hand feature and we can have you unmute yourself and ask your question aloud. Also want to remind folks this presentation is being recorded, so it'll be available on our website here in the coming weeks. At this time, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Professor Dr. Jason Jolly to introduce our speaker today.
All right, well, thanks everyone. So very excited to have Dr. Steve Deller with us today from the University of Wisconsin. You all saw Steve's bio in the invitation and materials for the session, so I won't go over that again, but really thrilled to have him with us. I've always thought of Dr. Deller as one of the more creative thinkers in economic development, and particularly in the application of how do we engage in economic development to make real world impact and improve the lives of people and improve communities in which we live and work. And that's certainly very, very near and dear to the heart of the Voinovich School and the work that we do here in Ohio. So I think there's a lot of important things we can learn from the work that Steve's been doing on what we think of as the fourth wave of economic development that intersects with a lot of concerns and also opportunities that we have here in our region. So with that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you again. If folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we get towards the end, we'll look at the questions in the chat, and then if we have enough time, we'll folks can unmute and even ask their questions live. So go ahead and take it over, Dr. Deller.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the delays. First day of class, students were lining up to talk to me after class, so I apologize. That's my fault for not kicking them out of the classroom. I want to thank you, first of all, for inviting me to share with you some of the work that I've been doing. I've been working with rural communities here in Wisconsin for over 30 years, and in Maine before that. So I'm looking at this from kind of how rural communities are approaching economic development and how our thinking has kind of changed over time. And I think we're in a new way of thinking about it. And I want to share that with you. So come on. Why is my computer? Oh, there we go. I want to share with you that this is based on a series of research studies that I've been doing for a number of years, including some work with a colleague, John Halstead, at the University of New Hampshire. We were looking at small rural manufacturing plants. And one of the things that we walked away from is, quality of life of the community really matters a lot. Then a second study, I had an opportunity to attend a conference with Paul Krugman before he became famous, and had a chance to have lunch with him. And this was right after he came out with this new economic geography. And this was a group of rural economists. And we were asking him, so what does your new economic geography mean for rural areas? And it basically is rural America is not going to do very well. But yet, at the same time, there are a lot of rural places across America that are doing very well, thank you very much. And what it is, it's quality of life, it's natural amenities and things like that. And then the last piece is kind of my attempt to kind of lay out the logic of why we've entered this new way of thinking about economic development that hinges on quality of life. And for a lot of rural areas, kind of natural amenities, okay? There's a long, rich tradition of the public sector trying to influence economic growth. New Jersey, the state of New Jersey in 1791 offered tax incentives to Alexander Hamilton to influence the location of a manufacturing plant. The famed Erie Canal was really based on public investment in transportation infrastructure. It was an economic development strategy that that justified building the Erie Canal. Indeed, the earliest corporations were the creations of states to provide a mechanism for the public sector to make these private sector investments. Indeed, the Erie Canal came out of one of these very first corporations. In 1884, the state of Pennsylvania had invested over $100 million. Think about what this would be in today's dollars. And it placed promoters on the state board of more than 150 corporations to try to convince businesses to invest in Pennsylvania. We have a long, rich tradition of trying to influence local and regional economic growth. Currently, there is a lot of media attention to large tax incentive-based programs. There is the Amazon World Headquarters 2, where Amazon basically came out and said, okay, we're open for bids. Who's going to offer us the most money? And New York came up with $3 billion in subsidies. They subsequently ended up going outside of Washington, D.C., but it was basically give us money and we will locate there. In Wisconsin, we had the Foxconn debacle. Essentially, Foxconn, that's a Taiwanese manufacturer, was interested in building a facility in the U.S. And they wanted to be kind of close to Chicago, but not in Illinois. Well, guess what? Southeastern Wisconsin was identified, and the state started throwing money at them to the tune of $3 billion. And they ended up not really doing much of anything. But these kind of big ticket items is kind of the way that a lot of folks think about economic development, is that you offer big tax incentives to major corporations to get them to locate there. Okay, this can be traced back. This approach can be traced back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture with Industry Act of 1933. Okay, this goes way back to the Great Depression. And what Mississippi was trying to do is that they realized that they were an agricultural-based economy and they wanted to diversify. And the way that they wanted to go about doing it is they wanted to try to convince manufacturers from the northern states to pick up and move. Now, why would they do that? Well, they said that they had a very positive business climate. And this positive business climate essentially centered around cheap labor, cheap land, limited regulations, and limited taxation. Today, there's a large contingency of folks that think that in order to promote economic growth and development, you need to have a positive business climate. And that means low taxes, limited regulations, and cheap labor. Okay. These were the first shots fired between the new war between the states. Okay. Now, our understanding of firm location theory at that time, that kind of made sense. If you look at the neoclassical firm location model, they kind of say that firms kind of go through a two-step process when they're making a decision where to invest, okay, where to build. And the first step is they need to pick a general area. Suppose that there's a firm that is thinking they want to move in and they want to be someplace around Chicago, Indianapolis, maybe Cincinnati, Detroit, maybe over to Pittsburgh. Those markets would be these kind of what I've got S's, S1, S2, S3 that defines this market area. If you need to be within those areas because that's where your market is, that's where your input suppliers are, you want to be someplace within that geographic area. It doesn't make sense to say if my major input suppliers are Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, to locate in Florida. That doesn't make sense, okay? But that's just the first step. Once they kind of decide, okay, that's the region that they want to be in, and say it's kind of Indiana, Ohio is where we want to be, they got to find a specific location, okay? Now, that's where local cost factors can come into play, okay? It might be, in this example, the transportation cost minimizing location is S star. Okay, that's where they should be. That minimizes transportation costs. But there's these other places that are close to that that actually have cheaper land, cheaper labor, maybe fewer regulations. So we may want to move to those other places identified by C1 and C2 on this chart. This is where this notion of a business climate made sense from a purely theoretical perspective. Okay, now for large manufacturing, this made a lot of sense. Now, back in the 1930s and the 1940s and into the 50s, Manufacturing was kind of the engine of economic growth. So this kind of approach seemed to make a lot of sense, but that's over 50 years ago. A lot has changed since then. Okay. So the first wave of economic development is industrial recruitment with a focus on manufacturing. It can be traced directly back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture and Industrial Act, and it drove home the idea that a positive business climate required cheap labor. In other words, unions are bad, and we need things like right to work legislation, cheap land, low taxes, and limited regulations. Okay. Now, the problem, though, is that states are still promoting this. These are cut and paste off of different state economic development agencies, organization. This is from the Office of the Governor of Texas. The bits that are underlined are the relevant. The best business climate in the nation. One of the lowest overall tax burdens in the country. Over $4 billion in tax relief for businesses. A right to work state. Remember, right to work is a policy that basically tries to undermine the formation of unions. Okay, North Carolina. Our state has the lowest corporate income tax rate in the country. Business costs rank amongst the lowest in the nation. There's less red tape and litigation. It's harder to be sued if you locate in North Carolina. Okay, Florida. Same thing. It's a pro-business state tax policies, competitive costs of doing business, streamlined regulatory environment, insurance tort reform, targeted industrial incentives, right to work, low tax environment, no personal income tax. These are all strategies that are associated with what the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture and Industrial Act established. Okay, Tennessee, right to work. No personal income taxes on wages. Local tax burdens are amongst the lowest. There's a pattern here that's occurring. Idaho, we keep our costs and tax low. We remove the burdensome regulations. Okay, these are all consistent with that first wave of thinking about business climate. Okay, so big firms are the focus of attention. What's good for General Motors is good for America. That's kind of the underlying premise here. Foxconn, major manufacturer. We need to work with these big firms. Tax incentives, throw money at businesses to move to your state. Okay. Public dollar investment in infrastructure. With the Foxconn, this is where we kind of lost a lot of money, is that the state put a lot of public money in terms of investing in transportation infrastructure out to the site where Foxconn was supposed to be located. Part of that was not only running water lines, sewer lines, rail lines, highway lines, but also utility lines for electricity. They're now ran out to basically a big vacant lot because Foxconn never really built anything there. Okay. The second wave, okay, focuses on smaller businesses. The work by David Birch in 1981, the late 1970s, early 1980s, found that there's strong evidence that job growth comes not from large, but smaller businesses. And more recent work notes that, in particular, it's new firms, okay? This notion of focusing on big companies, what's good for General Motors is good for America. Guess what? That may have been true in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but it's not true today. Okay. Indeed, if you look at job creation from existing businesses and new business formation or entrepreneurship, existing businesses are either they're stagnant, they're not changing, they're keeping their employment level the same, or they're laying people off, or they're closing, or they're expanding and they're hiring people. So for existing businesses, we want to look at that net change. Now, this is for the nation. Since 1978, net job growth from existing businesses has been negative, except for 1984. That's the only year. In 1978, the beginning of the time period, it was flat. Okay. Existing businesses are shutting more jobs than they're adding. Job growth is coming from entrepreneurship. It's coming from new business formation. And Birch was the first one to start pointing this out. Okay. So the second wave is that local economic development corporations started focusing on existing businesses. For example, the Green Bay Chamber of Commerce here in Wisconsin, go Packers, is that they established what's called a business retention and expansion program. And this is a very popular strategy that's coming out of the second wave. And what we want to do is that we want to focus on the businesses that are in our backyard. We want to make sure that they're profitable, that they're in a position to expand, and they're not going to move. Okay. And that's what this business retention and expansion program can do. It can range from the very simplistic, where you get an economic development director, you get a city official, you get maybe a county official, and they go and they visit with businesses that are in the community, and they sit down and they say, hey, we're really pleased that you elected our community to do business. How are you doing? What can we do to help you in terms of expanding your business? And through these kind of discussions, you're building things like social capital, you're identifying problem areas, and perhaps if there's a reoccurring theme that you're hearing from all these different businesses, that gives the community something to focus on. Okay, so the keys here is the growth and expansion of existing businesses and the creation of new businesses. Their third part here, this is the Green Bay Chamber. Their third is attraction of external firms. What they do is they basically say, we're not going to go out and try to recruit. Okay, that's not a good use of our time, but we will be prepared if a business comes knocking on our door. We want to be in a position that we can respond in a positive way. So the shift has been from recruitment, big businesses, to let's look at what's in our backyard already. Okay, so the second wave, the second thing is the U.S. economy has been shifting from a goods producing economy, manufacturing, to a service producing economy. Okay, manufacturing is really no longer the backbone of the U.S. economy. For example, this was a real eye opener for a lot of economic development officials. Is Citibank. Citibank was one of the very first companies to come up with the idea of a credit card, your Visa, your MasterCard. Okay, they kind of pioneered that. And when they were pioneering this, their headquarters of how they did this was in Manhattan, New York City. Okay, they needed to be near all the technical resources in order to get this new idea up and running. Okay, they needed access to technical, financial experts. They needed marketing experts. They needed all the things, the critical mass of skills that were in around Wall Street. Okay, but as they got established, right, and the size of the credit card business expanded, particularly the processing of those credit cards grew. They found that operating in Manhattan, New York City was extremely expensive. It didn't make sense for them to continue to locate there. So what did they do? They picked up and they moved. Where did they move to? They moved to South Dakota. This was a real eye opener because, wait a minute, this isn't manufacturing. This is the service sector, and it could be a major source of employment for our communities. So economic development practitioners started shifting away from focusing on manufacturing to focusing on the service sector. Okay. Now, the third wave is what is sometimes referred to as public-private partnerships with a focus on clusters. This is largely due to the work of Michael Porter and the Economic Development Administration's embracing of Porter's notion of clusters. Okay. If you wanted EDA money to support your economic development efforts, right, you had to talk in terms of economic clusters. Okay. Now, the idea here was rather than kind of be kind of a shotgun approach or a scatter approach to the types of industries that you're working with, what Porter suggested is you need to be more strategic. You need to think in terms of what are the industries that we have a comparative advantage in? What are the industries that we already have here? What are the industries that could be expanding? So Porter kind of opened up the idea that we need to be more strategic. We need to focus a little bit more. The other thing that came out of this notion of clusters is that a lot of communities realized that they're part of a much larger regional economy. These economic clusters don't respect political boundaries. A lot of communities started to realize that they needed to work and partner with neighboring communities. And one of the ways they did this is to form these public-private partnerships. So now you have public entities coming together with people from the private sector to try to move these economic clusters forward, okay? And the idea then is to make investment in public institutions that can support the cluster. So you got a regional approach now, you got communities that are working together, and you've got the private sector and the public sector working more closely together to identify different strategies, okay? Now, one of the things that has come out of this is, trying to identify a lot of the research is how do you identify what is a cluster? How do you identify what industry you should be focusing on? Now, Porter and his group at Harvard University have developed a large number of different industries that stand out. Okay, like Cleveland and Louisville is paints and coatings. It's a manufacturing. Pittsburgh is advanced materials, energy. If you look at Wisconsin, this is a mapping of where all the cheese plants are at. Okay, why do you think Wisconsin, we call ourselves the cheesehead state? We're the dairy state. Why? We have a lot of cheese plants here. We have a lot of dairy. Over 90% of all the milk that's produced in Wisconsin goes into making cheeses. Okay, now the cheese industry in Wisconsin is kind of breaking into two. One is kind of what we call the commodity market. This is, mozzarella or cheddar cheese that goes on frozen pizzas. Okay, that's one part. It's going to, we're selling to McDonald's, we're selling to frozen pizza companies, we're selling to, food chains, things like that. There's a second market that's a specialty cheese market, okay? And that's a smaller, more niche, more targeted type of market, okay? So we're spending a lot of time in Wisconsin worrying about dairy and cheese manufacturing. The other cluster that we have in Wisconsin is the paper mill, the paper making industry, okay? Now, unfortunately, the paper making industry is moving in the wrong direction. When I was at the University of Maine, the paper industry was the backbone of rural Maine. It's not anymore. The reason is because a lot of those manufacturing facilities are getting really old. And the companies are making the decision, do we invest in these really old facilities or do we build new? Well, they were making the decision, we're not going to invest in Maine. We're going to invest in new facilities in the South. In Wisconsin, we're seeing the exact same pattern play out. So yeah, we got a cluster, it's paper, but is that a risk to the Wisconsin economy? Now, you want to talk about having a hot political discussion in Wisconsin is to say the future of manufacturing in Wisconsin is not the paper industry. You will get a lot of discourse on that topic, okay? Another one, wineries. When you think of wine, you think of Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley. Actually, the number of vineyards and wineries is really growing rapidly across the US. There are certain pockets where we're seeing a tremendous growth in the wineries. Look at the Pacific Northwest. Look at that kind of New York to Washington, D.C. corridor. You're seeing some popping up in Ohio. You're seeing them popping up around Cincinnati. Now, why Cincinnati? Okay, Chicago, I get. The Twin Cities, I get. Houston, Dallas, I get. Denver, even. But Cincinnati, you can see Atlanta popping up. Okay, market opportunities. Okay. Now, for a viable cluster, it's more than just businesses interconnected through geographic grouping of supply chains. Traditionally, a cluster is through supply chains. Okay, you have a critical mass of different businesses that are basically part of the same industry. And we historically think about that through supply chains. But one of the things that makes for a viable cluster is this notions of social capital. Okay, social capital here really is talking about businesses that are able to connect and share information and learn from each other, okay, to become more competitive. Okay, businesses are competitors by nature. Okay, but a viable cluster is essentially saying that, we need to kind of work together a little bit here. In order for these public-private partnerships to work together, we have to kind of work together a little bit. An example, in Wisconsin, we're seeing growth in small-scale plastics manufacturing. And there's a center part of the state that has actually seen a viable small plastics cluster starting to form. And the reason is because that there was an attempt to get the different cluster or plastics manufacturers together in the same room to talk about issues affecting the industry. Okay. And it kind of took off. There's now a plastics association that is working. Businesses are working through this association, through this public-private partnership, to work with the technical schools for professional development. They're working together to talk to the state legislature for changes in the rules and the regulations to help them. Okay, they're working together. There's another group of plastics manufacturers that are in the western part of the state, heading towards the Twin Cities. They tried to replicate it, and they got together in a room, and the reaction was, what are they doing here? They're my competitor. I'm not going to work with them. They're my competitor. And the whole thing fell apart. Okay. The difference between those two can be related to in terms of social capital. Okay. And that's very important. And that's oftentimes an overlooked phenomenon. And that's where the public sector can come in, because they can help facilitate that. Okay, the other thing that started to come out of the third wave is that people started to realize that there are multiple factors at play here beyond taxes, labor, land, and regulations, that we needed to start a systems thinking approach. Okay, because there's a lot of moving pieces here, and we need some way to kind of keep track of all these different moving pieces. Now, there are two that are kind of two systems thinking approaches that have been introduced into the community economic development literature. One is the Schaefer-Star that I was involved in developing, so I have a bias towards that. The other is the Flores Community Capitals. I think the community capitals is actually taking on a greater role. I've actually seen some economic development corporations in rural Wisconsin using the Flores Community Capitals to help them think their way through some of these different issues. Now, when you look at this, and you look at these community capitals, there's lots of different things here that we can be thinking about to make this local community more vibrant. Okay, this has opened the door for a lot of communities to think beyond simply businesses and taxes and regulation. Okay, now, what I wanted to do with this is I wanted to kind of test to see if there's been a structural shift in this relationship between people moving around and jobs moving around. And there's this framework that's been around for a number of years. And it's essentially, do people follow jobs, or do jobs follow people? And this is a simple little model that has been used in academia for years. And what we can do is that we can actually look at the results of these models using, statistical techniques to come up with estimates. We can actually kind of say, do people follow jobs or do jobs follow people? Historically, the perception is that people follow jobs. Okay. So the economic development implication is that you focus on jobs. You create employment opportunities, you focus on businesses, and then people will follow those jobs. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Well, that may not be true. Okay. What I've done is, and I'll go through these fairly quickly, is that I've looked at how these models have changed over time. Okay. And in each one of these, what I'm finding is that jobs follow people. It's a consistent finding. Okay. I did a simple little OLS model. I advanced it, kind of a robustness check. I added some controls. Again, I'm finding that jobs follow people. Okay. This is another more advanced statistical technique. And again, to test the robustness of the results, or am I getting consistent results across different ways of doing this? And guess what? Here's one. 2015 to 2019, it flips. I think that's an anomaly. Okay. Consistently here over most time periods, jobs follow people. This has a real implication on how we think about economic development. Communities are shifting away from a jobs focus of economic development to a people view. I think we're entering the fourth wave here. Okay. Because this is kind of a fundamental shift in how people are doing it. Now, the realization, is there a realization that jobs follow people? I think so. Okay. And, as we enter the systems thinking approach to economic growth and development, I think that we are, and that's part of this new fourth wave. Okay. Now, one of the studies that I shared with you 3 studies at the very beginning. This was that study of rural manufacturers, rural being non-metropolitan, small manufacturers, small being less than 100 employees. We were looking at Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And we were trying to find out what's the trade-off between infrastructure and taxes. And what we found is that quality of life trumped everything. This was an old paper survey, and somebody wrote in the margin of the survey, find an area that you want to live, then you start your business. Okay. This was a real eye-opener to me, because this was essentially saying that this old school way of thinking about business climate really wasn't relevant, particularly to small businesses and new businesses. And remember, new businesses are the engines of economic growth. This really got me rethinking what's going on. Second, there was a really great study by Mark Henry and Dave Barkley and a student of theirs that were looking at South Carolina. And what they were looking was spread and backwash effects of urban areas. So they had 8 economic urban centers, and then they had kind of the surrounding hinterland. And what they were doing is that they were tracking population density and economic activity across those urban areas and their surrounding area. And what they found is that there's both a spread effect. Economic activity is spreading out from that urban center into the rural land. But there's also evidence of backwash, where that rural area is basically being sucked into that urban center. The driving factor, quality of life. They were looking at things like expenditures on libraries, expenditures on parks and recreation, and school performance. Things that are associated with quality of life drove these results. It wasn't employment, it wasn't income, it was quality of life. Amanda Wetstein, who's just put out a Brookings paper on quality of life and growth, and essentially found the same thing. Okay, is that quality of life really matters. Quality of life is something that people think about. not necessarily businesses. Okay. Placemaking as an economic development strategy. This is a term that comes out of the planning literature. And what this is that, rather than making investments and focusing on, keeping our taxes low, keeping our regulations limited, keeping our land cheap, keeping our labor cheap, and making us attractive to businesses. No. We should be making investments that make us attractive to communities or to people. For example, investment in local schools. Okay, everybody agrees investment in local schools is vitally important. Under the old paradigm, okay, first, second, and third wave, the idea really was that you were investing in schools to produce labor for the business community. Okay, under the fourth wave of placemaking, no, we're investing in schools because we want to make them the types of schools that people want to send their kids to. We're still investing in schools, but we're doing it for fundamentally different reasons. Okay. Why would people want to move into this community? Why would people want to start a business in this community if they've got really crappy schools? They're not going to. Okay. Now, should this fourth wave be top down or bottom up? Okay. I think it should probably not top down. Okay. Glasser and Gottfried make an argument in a paper that in order for this to work, it's really got to be at the community level. The state really isn't in a position to do this. Okay. It really needs to be driven by local regional efforts that reflect the unique situation and the desires and the objectives of that particular community. So this idea that one size fits all really doesn't work in the fourth wave of thinking. You got to look at what makes your community unique, what makes the quality of life in your community really attractive, why people would want to live here. Okay, but we're still focused on this jobs. John Oliver has this great video, it's on YouTube, that really kind of outlines in a very effective way, why are we so obsessed with jobs? When in reality, we should be focused on people. Okay. Well, we're still focused on it because our politicians keep talking about it. Okay. These are, for example, the former mayor is running for the governorship of Arizona, right? Basic economic development and jobs. The mayor of London was running for a second re-election, and notice that as one of his objectives will be jobs. Trudeau, the prime minister of Canada, talks in terms of jobs. Okay, our politicians tend to think, what is my economic development policy? It's jobs. Well, why do we do that? If all the research is suggesting that, and communities are starting to shift gears and move into this fourth wave, why do we keep going back to smokestack chasing? Okay. Why do we keep going back to Foxconn? Or here, the Milwaukee Brewers, the sports teams do this all the time. Sports teams, professional sports teams will basically say, build us a new stadium or we're leaving. Okay. And the local government in the state starts scrambling. What are we going to do? And, in Milwaukee, they actually built a new stadium and they imposed a special sales tax that was to basically pay for it. Now, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan. So I thought, I don't want my tax dollars going to the Brewers. However, I went to a Brewers game in the old stadium. Oh, man, they needed a new stadium. They really did. Okay. Now, that stadium being rebuilt was argued as an economic development strategy, jobs. Not really. That new stadium was a quality of life investment. Okay. It gave Milwaukee something to be proud about. It gave kind of this, going out to Brewer Stadium in this new facility was a source of pride. Okay. That's fundamentally different than say throwing a lot of money at a Foxconn to have them move in. Okay. Now, part of the problem here is that if you look at these large firms, institutional location theory, what this essentially says is that large firms have an outside leverage. When large companies are, saying, hey, we want to make an investment in your community, like Amazon with its world headquarters too, basically said, hey, we want to make an investment in your community. What are you going to do for us? Okay. The problem is that the company has asymmetric information. Okay. It's like playing poker. You got your cards close to your vest, but the local government or the state government is basically playing with all their cards face up. Okay. The company has an unfair advantage and they take advantage of that. Okay. This is a theoretical reason why we should not be playing the incentives game, because companies, a profit maximizing incentive, can play that game and they will win that game because they have all the information. Okay. Moltock's growth machine theory, does that come into play? What this is essentially saying is that there are certain people that can drive the economic growth process because they're in a position to benefit personally the most. This can be local landowners, local real estate developers, the type of people that will benefit directly from that development. They have, sometimes they have outsourced or outsized influence on the decision-making process. So the voice of the community is not necessarily heard. Okay. Peter Eisinger, who was a political scientist here at UW-Madison, wrote a book called The Rise of the Entrepreneurial State in 1988. And this is when the second wave was really in force. And he was like, good, congratulations, we need to be doing this. Okay. But then he wrote a follow-up piece that essentially said that the demise of the entrepreneurial state is dead. We're going backwards, moving away from small business development, entrepreneurship, to industrial recruitment. We're going backwards. He argued, why is that? Okay. The problem is that at the state and federal level, policymakers have a very high discount rate. What that means is they need it and they need it now. Okay. But at the local level, people are making investments with the eye towards their children. What can we do to make this a better place for our children and for our grandchildren? Okay. Now, because policymakers have a very high discount rate, they tend to go after shiny things. Now, why do state and federal policymakers go after short-term shiny things? It's because they're trying to get reelected. They have to be able to point to something that they did. Okay. Now, with Foxconn in Wisconsin, our governor at the time, Scott Walker, thought, oh, this is gold. This is gold. This is going to get me reelected. Well, it kind of blew up in his face, and I'm convinced that's why he didn't win re-election. It's because a lot of the rest of the state was like, why are you using my tax dollars to support that part of the state yet again? You use my tax dollars to build a stadium in Milwaukee. Now you're using my tax dollars to pay for something that's being developed just north of the Illinois border. And there was a backlash on that. And then Foxconn never did deliver. Okay. So I keep going back to this. This is what that responded on that manufacturers. Make investments that will make your community as attractive to this person as much as possible. Find an area that you want to live, then you start your business. That's at the heart of the fourth wave. Okay, so what can you do? You invest in good schools, not to feed the labor market, but to be attractive to families with children. Public safety. Do I feel safe walking my dog at midnight? Recreation, libraries. You want to invest in these things because these are the types of things that people are looking for. Community fairs and festivals, things like art in the park, farmers markets, music on the square. These are simple little quality of life factors that can actually make this a nice place to live. It also draws community members together. And that drawing community members together builds a stronger sense of community. Notice that these are not real big, multi-million-dollar tax incentives. Okay. What we're doing is that we're essentially saying, look, I'm willing to raise my taxes if it's making investments in things that makes this a better place to live. It's sending a signal to people that, hey, this community is serious about itself. Okay. It's a different way of going about it. Other thing is viable local business organization, including professional development opportunities for local businesses. This is something that is kind of a pet project of mine, is when you get into smaller rural communities and you have things like a business association or a chamber of commerce, what are they doing for their membership? You talk to a lot of these smaller town chamber of commerce, you ask, well, what do you do? Oh, we host the 4th of July parade. Oh, that's nice. What else do you do? Oh, that's it. We need to be doing more. What can the local business organizations do to help enhance the professional development of their members, and particularly new businesses moving in? Okay. Free public Wi-Fi is something we're getting a lot of money. I mean, out of the federal government and out of the state government, throwing a lot of money at broadband. We need to get thinking beyond simply getting fiber in the ground to actually making it accessible to people. Active volunteer organizations. Okay, we need to get people involved. Early childhood education, childcare. In Wisconsin, when you talk across rural Wisconsin, there are 4 issues that keep popping up: broadband, housing, labor shortages, childcare. I don't care where you're at in the state, those 4 issues keep coming up again and again and again. Okay. Create networking opportunities for small business owners and those interested in starting a business. That goes back to that chamber of commerce or that business organization. Are they welcoming to newcomers? Are they reaching out to the larger community and encouraging potential entrepreneurs from getting involved and helping them? Be open and receptive to newcomers to the community. There's a series of studies that's called the Iowa Small Town Project out of Iowa State University at Ames. They've been tracking small rural Iowa towns, small 5,000 to 10,000 people, for over 30 years. And what they're finding is that social capital matters a lot. Communities that are open and receptive to new ideas, to newcomers, they're trying new things, they're reaching out. Those communities are doing okay. Some of them are actually doing quite well, thank you very much. Communities that are more closed in, they're not open to newcomers, they're not open to new ideas, they're not open to new information. Those communities are struggling, mildly struggling. Okay. And the Small Town Iowa Project folks are talking about it in terms of social capital, particularly bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Bonding is kind of that internal looking, like you belong to a church. Okay. How connected are you to other members of the church? That's a form of bonding social capital. What the research is suggesting is that bridging social capital, reaching outside of your traditional network, is more important. For example, is there a council of ministers in the community? Do the local religious organizations get together and work on community issues as a group? That's a form of bridging social capital. Okay. That is extremely important. Okay. Do the strategies that flow from these different waves of thinking replace those that came before? No, I think rather it's a reorientation of our thinking and refocusing on types of strategies to consider. One could think in terms of broadening our approaches, okay? Rather than saying, okay, we're not going to do business recruitment anymore. We're going to throw that out the window. No, there's going to be less emphasis on that. We're not going to actively recruit businesses. That's not a good use of our time. But what we are going to do is be prepared to respond if a business comes knocking on our door. Okay. Are we going to abandon our business retention and expansion program? No, that's still an important part of our program. Our public-private partnerships that were kind of this regional approach. No, we're still going to be actively involved in those. Okay? But we need to be broader. We need to be thinking beyond simply businesses. We need to be thinking about people. And why should people want to live in this community? Okay, that to me is the fourth wave. And within the planning literature, it's oftentimes referred to as placemaking. And, however you want to talk about it, I think the idea is that we're shifting away from jobs, business, to people. Okay. We're not abandoning working on entrepreneurship. We're not abandoning helping existing businesses be more profitable. We're not abandoning being responsive when if a business comes knocking on the door. We're not abandoning those. We're shifting our priorities a little bit. Okay. I think this is an exciting time for a lot of community economic development because it's got people thinking differently. And that in and of itself is entrepreneurial, if you will. And because it's entrepreneurial, it is actually helping the community try new things, learn from mistakes, reach out to neighboring communities, find out how is this community doing it, how is that community doing it. And I think that that's going to make our communities much more vibrant, much more resilient, and much more dynamic in the long term. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. I noticed that there's a lot of questions in the chat box. And to be honest with you, I haven't been paying any attention to the chat box, and I apologize for that.
So thank you, Steve. Mackenzie had put in the chat box, we're okay to go to about 2:15 or so. If folks need to jump off, that's fine. There are some questions. There's also some pontification. And I'll say that because these are people that I work with. So I'll say they're the pontificators in the chat box as well.
As long as we don't get into an argument about how many angels are on the head of a pin.
So you can see those in the chat box. If you want to look at a few of those and go ahead and tackle them, that'd be great. I know one question that I have, and maybe you can weave this in as you're looking at the other questions. So here in Ohio, there's the large investment in the Intel facility, which is going to be coming to Ohio, and it ties into the U.S. CHIPS Act and the move to bring semiconductor production back onshore, reshoring, et cetera, et cetera. And so, those decisions have been made by people not on this call, right? And that's happening. So many of our communities are trying to think about what they could do to take advantage of Intel coming to Ohio in terms of being an attractive place for potentially remote workers. So I'd be kind of interested in your thought about remote work, for even their own current citizens, maybe getting employment there, but for new people who might move in and say, hey, I don't have to drive every day to the Intel facility. I can live an hour away because I only go one day a week in this little quaint town in Appalachia because they have great quality of life. So kind of be interested in your thoughts there, as well as some of the things in the chat. I think you'll see some commonalities.
I think that the Intel plant coming into Ohio is an example of where you don't abandon the first wave. Okay. When an opportunity like this presents itself, you seriously think about it. The problem is when the company starts demanding incentives. That's a slippery slope. And we can end up giving away more than it's worth from the perspective of the taxpayer. And the reason is because the company knows what they need and they don't need. They know that extra little thing you just threw on the table, we don't need that, but if you're going to do it, we're going to take it. The classic example is Mercedes-Benz, when they were first looking at building their first manufacturing facility in the US. They were going to make their new SUVs. And they had it down between South Carolina and Alabama. And South Carolina and Alabama were so caught up in the game of recruitment that they were throwing things on the table that Mercedes is like, this is getting silly. But Mercedes, as a profit maximizing company, is like, look, if you're going to keep giving us handouts, we're going to keep taking them. Although we've made the decision, we're going to Alabama, but they kept playing the game. They kept playing the game. And the last thing that Alabama threw on the table was that the state would buy 100 of these vehicles every year for their state fleet. Okay. Now think about that. You work for a public university, and you're working with a poor rural community, and you show up in a brand new Mercedes that has the state symbol on the side. How do you think that's going to go over? Okay. Alabama and South Carolina were so caught up in playing the game that they lost out. Okay. So we need to have that conversation, but we can't be in a position of simply throwing everything at the company, because they will take advantage of us. Now, in terms of a lot of these rural communities, the idea would be, okay, we're in a good position to become a bedroom community to these facilities. Okay, the notion of stretch commuting, of commuting long distances for work, is getting larger and larger and larger. People are willing to live in a more remote rural area and drive to work than they were 15, 20 years ago. So that commuting shed around that Intel plant is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of spatial size. How many communities are now in a position to say, hey, work at the Intel plant, but live here? Why would they want to live there? You got good schools, you got good parks, you got a good library, you got a local brew pub that has live music on Friday, and the band's not very good, but who cares? Those types of amenities that people are attracted to. You've got really good schools. I want to send my kids to those schools. I think that's important. Now, you bring up remote work. That's tough, because right now, the idea of remote work is largely anecdotal stories. I've been talking with Heather Stevens, Jason, Heather, about, and Matt Kears, who I think here, about how do we study the potential for remote work for high amenity rural communities. And our data is not set up that way. Our data is set up that you live here and this is your job, your business. It's really difficult to address the spatial dimensions to remote work with the data that we currently have. So the potential for remote work in these high amenity areas is theoretically pretty high. Part of the problem, though, is how businesses are still playing this out. Okay, we have 3 large employers in Madison. One is Epic. It's a major software company. They went completely remote, and their employees loved it. And well, now they're saying, we want you back, because they put a lot of money into a really nice campus. They want people back. And the employees are going, no, we don't want to come back. Okay, how is that going to play out? American Family Life Insurance, they went remote, and they basically told their employers that you have an option. You can remote work 3 days a week, come in 2 days a week. Well, now American Family Life Insurance is rethinking that, and employers are not happy. CUNA, the Credit Union National Association, which is housed here in Madison. It's kind of the central clearinghouse for credit unions. They went 100% remote. They love it. How companies are responding to remote work is still playing out, and how the cards are going to end it's not completely clear.
Thanks, Steve. I'll let you tackle
This,
what you can do in the chat in the 5 minutes or so we have remaining.
that's what I'm looking at. Yeah, I've got to run, but this feels like a multiple strategies approach and not a all or nothing. I think that's exactly right. And I think that this kind of a multidimensional approach, I think, increases the likelihood of having success, is because you're essentially, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, you're kind of spreading it around. You can almost look at this from a portfolio theory approach, of rather than putting all of your retirement funding on one stock company or on one stock, you're spreading it around. Okay, you're more likely to actually hit a couple of home runs and minimize that risk. Now, the question is that do rural communities have the capacity to do this? That's a legitimate question. But I think this is where these regional partnerships come into play, is because now if you kind of, realize that, hey, that community over there, they may be our arch enemy in high school basketball, but we need to work together. And through that cooperation and that kind of regional approach, suddenly you have critical mass that you can start doing, approaching a multi-strategy approach. Okay. And communities are embracing that. And if there's one good thing that came out of Porter's notion of clusters, is that you've got local communities that are working together to move the regional economy forward. Let's see now, what else is in the comment section?
Well, all down towards the bottom, I know one of my colleagues I work with, Dr. Natalie Cruz, is we're particularly interested in some of the climate change impacts, because we do have a lot of environmental work we do here. And are you seeing some of that impact decisions people are making yet with respect to company investments or even where people choose to live?
Not yet. I'm not seeing that. People are becoming increasingly aware of it. They're seeing it in terms of the weather. Wisconsin, a lot of the climate forecasts are saying that Wisconsin is uniquely positioned to actually benefit from climate migration. Now, what does that mean? It could be that because of climate change, Wisconsin could come out ahead, but it's still, it's more kind of discussion, thinking about it, what could be. I don't see communities actually acting on that right now. What we are seeing some conflict on in the last few minutes that we have is renewable energy investments. We've had some instances where productive farmland is being taken out of production and solar plants put in their place. And that's creating more conflict than I would have imagined. We're also having conflict in terms of the high tension wires to connect wind farms to the markets where that electricity is needed. We're getting a lot of NIMBYism. So on the one hand, people are saying we need renewable energy, but on the other hand, we don't want it in our backyard. And it's kind of interesting to see how that's going to play out.
Steve, thank you for your time today. It's a lot of great comments. I've been getting a lot of texts from people saying that they're excited about your presentation, and some of my colleagues and I have done some work on community capital framework and social entrepreneurship. So I'm also getting those messages of, hey, let's engage Steve on some of this. So I know you and I talk frequently, but I'm sure you'll be in touch, maybe hear from some others at the school. So we really appreciate your time today. Mackenzie, I know you have some admin things you always do to wrap these up for the future. So Steve, unless you have a parting thought or two, I'll kick it over to Mackenzie.
Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Thanks, Steve. Want to echo Jason's thanks. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to give this really great presentation to the school today. Want to remind you all, we have our next monthly public service perspective session coming up on February 24th. That presentation will be from Susie Boxman. She is the Director of Programs at the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. Her presentation will focus on that her organization's assessment to look at curbside recycling and evaluating, when it makes sense to recycle. So stay tuned for announcements coming forward about that session. And I just hope you all have a great weekend and stay warm out there.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
see
for
you.
the invitation. Sorry, my class ran a little long this morning.
No worries.
No
at
worries.
all.
First day, first week, it's always a challenge. So glad you could be
Gotcha.
with us, Steve. So, all right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.